Welcome back to Coffee with Maxwell. This brick wall, I think, is going to become synonymous with me realising I want to include something in a video that I haven't and having to film it afterwards. This video has a few of this brick wall in. And I think that's partly because it's such a complex topic. This episode is probably quite contentious. What's the core of the question I want to ask in this episode? Well, it's whether people are telling the truth. It's whether the claims that are made about the supply chain of a coffee product hold up. It's whether you could verify them, substantiate them, third-party audit them and prove them. And this is quite a complex topic. Before I start to critique some of this messaging, I also want to say about how much I think the specialty coffee industry does well. I think if you could sum up the sourcing practices of the specialty coffee movement, it's really just about paying more for coffee. It's about focusing on quality, paying more, so there's more money to go through the supply chain, and therefore making coffee growing, experimentation, sustainable. And a lot of it really just relies on trusting people, trusting partners that we work with, people we buy from. There really is not. In fact, I would argue there's almost no third-party auditing. But in general, we rely on this mantra. And in general, it has a great impact. But it also has its flaws, it also has its holes, which I do want to tap into in this episode. I also want to explain why I think the competitive saturation in third wave or specialty wholesale coffee in the UK makes this more important than ever. Last year in 2020, there was a few coffee projects I was involved in which required different types of auditing. At the highest level, a full international ethical audit. This was a new experience for me. I'd not been involved in one of these before in coffee. And interestingly, specialty coffee doesn't really call for this. In fact, specialty coffee is quite anti-certification. And it got me thinking about how do you prove these claims you make? What does direct trade mean? What does 100% transparency mean? What does relationship coffee mean? What does it mean when you say we focus on sustainable farming? What does that actually mean? And the truth is, most of these terms are incredibly vague, but I also think that's a cop-out. You go, oh, well, it doesn't really mean anything, therefore we can all say it. Well, that's not quite true, is it? It definitely means something, right? It definitely infers something. Let's take the direct trade idea. What does that mean? Well, I think if you asked anybody who wasn't into coffee, they'd say, well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Rather than going through a supply chain and all the people in the middle, you go straight to the producer and you buy straight from them. I mean, that's not that vague, really. I think the reason coffee people say it's vague is because hardly anyone actually does that. Recently, last week, there was an Instagram post. It was a meme. I don't know if you've watched WandaVision on, it's always funny to say WandaVision, it sounds like One Division, but the Marvel series on Disney+. One of the characters is called Agatha Harkness. She's a witch. A very powerful witch, side topic. And her character breaks the fourth wall, so speaks to the audience. And what she does is she winks. And it's really over the top, and a lot of the series is set and supposed to mimic sitcoms. It's over the top behaviour. Anyway, that image of her winking at the camera has become a bit of a meme. And you stick some kind of writing above it, and the suggestion is, we say this thing, but we don't really mean it. And this was shared by Josh Tarlow, who is a coffee professional, has many accolades to his name, barista championships, brewers cups, but importantly, also has a lot of experience as defining, developing and heading up green coffee sourcing and roasting programs. And in this meme, the first slide is her winking at the camera, and the wording above says, all specialty coffee roasters, our coffee is direct trade. The subtext is, we know it's not, but we say it anyway. The second slide said, all our coffee is ethically sourced. Now, there seemed to be something that resonated with people there. And it wasn't just this post. I've been speaking to people around coffee, and it's definitely something that a lot of people in different companies in the community have noticed. It's something people are uncomfortable with. Now, just to be clear, there are companies who do not claim these things and who are very honest about the pros and cons. of their sourcing. And then there are companies that don't get the credit for how interesting their coffee programs are. But there's definitely a trend. Why does it worry me? Well, first of all, it worries me that the coffee community kind of think that's okay. What we're saying is none of us really think it's actually direct trade or ethically sourced, but everyone else says it, so we're going to say it. I kind of think it's horrifying. It's horrifying that a community that's based on integrity, values, honesty, transparency, is basically saying, yeah, we've kind of all ended up sort of lying really to customers. Now, I think this is more important than ever to address this topic. I don't have all the answers, but what I believe is it's important to question this particular trend. And the reason I say it's more important than ever is because there's never been as much of a commercial benefit to claiming these things. Because it will change the consumer's choice. If more consumers are buying based on these aspects of a product's background and its sourcing, it's commercially beneficial to be able to claim these things. You have a cafe or an office that says, we've spoken to 3 or 4 roasters. These ones do this with their supply chain. You're saying that you don't, we're going to buy it off them. That is a very basic example of a commercial incentive to say these things. And I think that's probably what explains part of the trend. But that trend is also specifically tied in, I think, with how saturated the market is. Now, this is a separate episode I want to do, which is this crazy race to the bottom in wholesale coffee supply into cafes in the UK amongst specialty roasters. Now, again, to be fair, it's not all of them. It's a select few really driving that price down. But if it's saturated, there's 2 things that are happening. You're looking for a USP. You're looking for something to say, we're different. This is what makes us us. This is our brand. This is why you should buy from us. But you have to recognize how dangerous these things are side by side. The commercial incentive to make these claims side by side with the market racing lower on price. Because that race on price puts pressure on values. It means that maybe you can't make those claims anymore. So it's important that when you race to the bottom, there's a point where you can't make the claim anymore. Let's go back exactly to these claims. What do they mean? Direct trade. Well, like I said earlier, it's pretty obvious what it means. There's 2 questions. Is anyone actually doing it? But probably the more important question is it the best way to source coffee? There are lots of potential benefits to a supply chain that has different entities throughout the distribution. But there are also downfalls, and the downfalls nearly always come with monopolization, racketeering, corruption, lack of a free market. Let's take Peak Water, for example. This is a jug that we made. You have a product and you sell it to someone else, a distributor, in this case Peak Water. They then have a customer base who buy lots of different equipment from them. Those customers might be roasters or retailers or cafes. They then buy the Peak Water jug. They then sell it to a consumer. So in that instance, maybe there's, after us, 3 or 4 other players in the supply chain before it gets to the customer. And that can be a positive thing. They can reach audiences we couldn't. Now, of course, what has to happen is that retail price for that jug has to have enough margin in it to share it amongst all those people so everyone can take their cut. But this idea of direct trade does come from an interesting place. It comes from a place where lots of coffee was blended at origin and exported with no transparency. So if you're really into specialty coffee, you're saying, well, I want to get that specific lot from that specific place to have that specific flavour profile. And also, I want to make sure that the farmer gets rewarded for it. In both those cases, the easiest way to potentially guarantee that is to cut everyone out in the middle. I get that, it makes sense. But there's also another side to going direct, and that is the roaster locking down the supply. That is a roaster going straight to the producer to cut out the people in the middle to save money. It's on the one hand, it's like, oh, look at this story of where we bought coffee direct. We went straight to this farm in Brazil and we brought the container in ourselves. That doesn't mean that that was better for the producer. Potentially, it just means you save money. But what I want to touch on here really is that, Going direct can be a good thing and it cannot be a good thing. It isn't simply the answer. And that shouldn't necessarily be the goal for all coffee companies. In fact, the whole movement of small independent coffee roasters, well, they rely on importers. They rely on green coffee companies. And really, sometimes I get frustrated because the roastery wants to tell its story and it wants to almost pretend that all of that amazing work the green company did was theirs. Well, just sorry, we don't really want to tell your story because you're in the middle. We just want to tell our story and the farmer's story and not your story. Now, green coffee importers are often in a better place to support a producer. A producer, they have, are in different regions, growing different qualities of coffee, but every farm or every collective, etc., has a variety of quality. When you pick coffee cherries, you sort it to the best ones, and those best ones have the highest score, and there's lots of ways to sort coffee, again, different episode. But the farmer really needs to sell all of that coffee. And a green company can often provide the farmer with more purchasing. So a small little independent roastery going over to a farmer and saying, can I please have 6 bags? Well, the farmer's got however many hundreds of bags left to sell to different people. So you're just one customer. There's 2 interesting bits here. Is you're not really giving the farmer, unless you're reasonably sized, you don't have the opportunity to have the buying power to give the farmer a lot of support. And just on the flip side here, the idea of a farmer tying in all their selling to one coffee roastery or one coffee business actually doesn't make any sense for the farmer. It leaves them exposed. It's a bit like me as a coffee roastery. If I have one client who bought all my coffee, well, if one year they say to me, we don't want to buy coffee from you anymore, Max, well, I'm screwed. I've got to sack all my staff and I've got no business. So actually the most sustainable coffee farm is the rockstar farms. It's the farms that have brands. It's the farms that have multiple clients. They always get the best price for their coffee if they have multiple clients, because the clients will want to bid against each other for the quality of the coffee, and potentially that gives the farmer the highest price. If they're tied into a 3-year contract with a roastery, well, yeah, they've got 3 years of security, but they're tied in. One key point for me about the fallacy of direct trade is the quality risk. If someone says, look, and again, one thing I do want to caveat here is it really is different region to region, country to country, locality to locality. So I've seen some amazing projects where a relatively large coffee company is in a region and they've worked with the producers and the producers need investment in a mill. That roastery buys a lot of coffee from there anyway, and it says, you know what, we're going to put money into your mill. That's a great, interesting relationship. Right, that's positive all day long. So there are examples of this. And that's probably what annoys me even more, is the companies that are doing it look on paper and on the website the same as the company that isn't really doing anything, because everyone just claims the same stuff. So quality. Talk to anyone who's imported coffee, who's grown coffee, harvested coffee. Any green bar at a roastery knows this. It is an agricultural crop. The quality varies. Take wine, for example. I spoke to some vineyard owners in France, and they have a really well-respected vineyard, and the price of their wine is extremely high. Now, if they have a really bad year, they are in a position where they actually think about not releasing that wine. It's not good enough. It's going to devalue the vineyard over time. Now, obviously, you need to be in the position to make that call, which I'm sure hardly any coffee farmers are. But that's interesting, right? And anybody who's traded coffee direct, I've done a little direct, I've shared a few containers with other roasters at the beginning, and it was just ridiculous. We went straight to Kenya and we shared a container. Turns up in Europe, and the lots don't taste good. The humidity's all over the place. It doesn't taste like it did when we tasted it in Kenya. Well, if I'm thinking about what I've promised my customers of Kelowna is incredible quality, well, I don't want to sell it. So what do? I find another home for it. I find someone who can buy it off me at a lower price and I lose money on it, rather than just sell it to my customers. But also, let's be honest, that there's new producers every year. There's different qualities in different regions. There's lots of challenges to make coffee taste great. And if you think about it, there's no real strong argument that going direct guarantees quality. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It increases the quality risk. It takes away that flexibility for you to be nimble and pick and choose based on what harvested best that year. Unless, of course, somebody said to me, oh, look, we've locked down Esmeralda. We've got their supply for 10 years. That's how we guarantee the world's best coffee. Well, yeah, but no one's doing that. That's not the context here. The more worrying ones are these ethical claims, these sustainable claims. And the reason they're interesting is the quality one is much more subjective, right? But the claim of what you paid people should or has the potential to be traceable. Sustainability is interesting. If you look at life cycle studies, coffee growing and coffee brewing has the biggest impact from a carbon footprint point of view. So, brewing that coffee with your espresso machine in your kitchen or even your kettle has a higher carbon footprint than the transit of it on the ocean or the packaging. And the growing of the coffee, the land that's required to grow that coffee, the resource, the water, the deforestation, all potentially has a bigger carbon footprint. If you can hear seagulls, I apologise. This is Bath. There are seagulls everywhere. Now, of course, the green importer is really driven by what the customer wants. And the customer of the green importer is the roastery. And you see this in the changing trends of green importers. You see green importers filling a container with smaller lots that only one roaster can buy. Yes, it's more expensive, but roasters want that differentiation in the marketplace. And the green company is in a position to do that, to explore those initiatives. But we should question the green company's claims as well. They are, in most cases, for a small specialty roastery, that access right through to figure out those things at a supply chain level. And when we talk to those green importers though, we're going to hit some brick walls. For me, the best examples of this are coffees from very well-known nations that produce delicious coffee, variable coffee, but delicious coffee a lot of the time, Ethiopia and Kenya. Now, Kenya, I think, often gets cited as one of the most challenging countries for transparency. I went to an amazing talk by Traboka, and when they realised that Kenyan coffee had been getting more expensive year after year, but the quality had been going down, they started to dig. And they realised that the pricing was going up, but less and less of the money was making it back to the producer. And therefore the producer wasn't investing in looking after their trees and their farm. So the tree health went down and the coffee quality went down. But if someone controls access to Kenyan coffee, then they can do that. Similarly in Ethiopia, very hard to get that transparency. In areas where you have to sell to a government and the government wants to control the trading of the coffee, it's very hard to get that transparency, very hard to guarantee that that money goes back. You're starting to get into some intense, complex topics here, like the political, cultural, structural challenges in that country. But let's go back to the beginning of this episode. What are we claiming? So if we're claiming we have 100, if I see a claim that there's 100% transparency in the supply chain, and then you source one of those Kenyan or Ethiopian coffees through those supply chains that lack that transparency and put it up on that website, it's just not true. And this is what often happens, is that that roaster will probably have one or two coffees from producers where they can tell an amazing story. They probably visited the farm, they probably got on a Skype call, or who uses Skype anymore? Google Hangout or Zoom, and they can tell that story. But then alongside that story is this other story of this coffee that isn't traceable. And what do you do there? I founded, co-own and run Glonna Roastery. Of course we're passionate and interested in our supply chain, but we don't make those claims. Partly because of that point I made about quality. I'm looking to utilise those green importers. I'm not going to say I'm going to go direct because I don't want to. I want to work with the best network to find the best coffee. Now, of course, I'm interested in what money ends up going straight through that chain. And with Kenya and Ethiopia, I've had to ask myself and my team, what are we going to do about that? I think that meme sort of says, really talks of complacency. It's that we all agree we're doing a cool thing and that this industry is great and we have a great impact. And we run these businesses and we're busy, and then we get sent some spot coffee from one of these countries. And yes, we have some coffees with interesting stories and focus, but we also buy these coffees from samples. And we don't ask, we don't dig, we don't go, well, tell me. I'm not going to buy coffee from Kenya or Ethiopia unless you can guarantee me more transparency in the supply chain. And what happens if you can't guarantee it to me? I have to seriously consider as a roaster if I want to support those origins. And that becomes a really complex question. But asking those questions are the questions we need to ask, especially if we're going to make these claims. If you don't want to ask those questions and you don't want to deal with how challenging that is, don't make the claims. You know, honestly, there's this really interesting side effect to independent businesses. There's so much I love about independent businesses, but they also get away with a ton scot-free. You know, a larger business gets given a really hard time. We have CSR, corporate social responsibility, ESG initiatives, environmental sustainable governance. You know, and it's great that these companies are being asked to really prove how they do things, that it could all be third-party audited. And that's really the question I have for you. Assuming that most of the people who follow this channel and are interested in what I have to say work in specialty coffee. You work in a specialty coffee business, you're a barista, you're a competitor, or you just are an enthusiast of specialty coffee. You need to ask yourself the question, if the coffees you were buying had a third-party audit, would they hold up? Would their claims be substantiated? And then we talk about the challenges. Well, what's the solution? So certifications, okay, fair trade wasn't aimed at specialty. It was aimed at commodity coffee. Did it do a great job? Well, arguably there was lots of flaws in it. And you know, it's very famous that fair trade doesn't really guarantee, in many cases, that higher price for coffee. But the customer was able to study that certification. They knew what the certification did and what it stood for. Does specialty coffee need to consider certification? What does that certification look like? Blockchain is something people talk about being able to trace the price through. Could that be used as a metric or a tool to document pricing? I'm excited by talking to other people in coffee that there could be something here. There could be a collective. We could get together. The challenge there is, you know, we just need to agree on some simple goals. But for me, it all starts with not being able to make claims that you can't substantiate. If we go back to the title of this episode, what can we claim about a coffee sourcing program? Well, it's a rhetorical question. It's an ironic question because the answer is anything. Right now, it's a wild west. Really, this has to be a problem, but it's not just a problem because it's misleading to the customer or it's just plain not true and that somehow we've got used to that. Clearly that's wrong. That doesn't sit right with anyone. But when you think about it, it stops us challenging ourselves. It stops specialty coffee businesses and the people in it challenging how we can improve those things because we're putting a logo on it and we're putting a statement on it that says tick, we solved that. So what we say isn't just about being fair to the customers, it's about being fair to ourselves and giving us that focus to move forward. Now, like I said at the beginning of this episode, there are great coffee companies doing great things, and on the whole, I do believe the specialty coffee movement has a huge and important impact. But that doesn't mean this is okay. I'm really keen to hear what people think about this topic. I think it's a really important topic, I think it's complicated, but I think it's the perfect conversation to be having. I'm really excited and interested to hear what you have to say in the comments below. And if you like this video and you like what I'm doing on the channel, please do like, share and subscribe.